really to explain why the United States is focusing on the Gulf, and even that has nomenclature controversy to it. The Iranians, understandably and historically, even legalistically, continue to insist that it be called the Persian Gulf. Soldiers and sailors, the latter particularly serving in Bahrain, had their mail addressed to them at Bahrain, Arabian Gulf. Once when I was sailing on a dhow for 3 days from Doha to Dost to Dira Dubai, I was the only Westerner, white guy, allowed on the dhow. And coming back from Oman, where about 40, coming back from Kuwait to go to Oman, where about 40 Kuwaitis, there were some undesirables who had been expelled from this or that prison here and there. And there were 5 or 6 Iranians who were evading the draft in Iran. And I thought, gee, this is an anthropologist, sociologist's dream. I can interview all of them about this body of water on which we're sailing as to the name. And so I started with the Omanis coming back from Kuwait. What is the name of the body of water on which we're sailing? And to a man, there were no women. There were women aboard, but there were no women amongst these. Said Arabian, Khadij Arabia. So I noted that duly. And then after I'd interviewed them, I turned to the Iranians who were getting steamed up as they were overhearing the answers and asked them on what is the name of the body of water on which we're sailing? And they all, to a person, said, Khalij Farisiya, a Persian Gulf. And I got to about the 3rd Iranian, and the temperature, not the summer heat, but the body heat was rising so rapidly and pointedly at me for making them angry that I thought if I don't stop, they're going to throw me overboard. So the nomenclature is contentious, and understandably. But this is the one part of the planet. Ponder the implications of this for any country's foreign policies. The one part of the globe to which the United States has mobilized and deployed more forces in the last 3.5 decades, killed more people than any other place on the planet in the last 3.5 decades, wounded more people than any other place on the planet, maimed them for life, caused to exist more external refugees than any other place on the earth for which the United States directly responsible. In other cases, it's indirectly involved and engaged and responsible, and to cause such a large number of domestically displaced people. Just take Iraq, with 24 million people before we invaded on March 19, 2003. Its population was 24 million. Immediately, 2 million fled, the cream of the crop, the best of the middle class and lower upper class, pharmacists, doctors, engineers, professors, lawyers, you name it. 1.3 million of them, by the way, to Syria, and the rest to Jordan in large numbers, and Beirut and Dubai and Gulf countries. But you add that 2 million to the 2 million displaced, that's 4 million, which is 1/6 of the Iraqi population. In American equivalencies, it would be 50 million people whose lives were shattered by a country that invaded us illegally. show your empathy card here in terms of suspending moral and other judgment and project yourselves into the shoes, soul situations of these millions of people who have suffered the implications of America's positions and policies and actions and attitudes toward that region. And by the way, the 1.3 million that went immediately to Syria, not one of them had a visa. As late as 3 years after we had invaded and begun the occupation, the total number of Iraqis, mind you, who became drivers, interrogators, translators, facilitators, expediters, assistant administrators for our occupation, the total we had let in was 28,000. 28,000 allowed into a country of 335 million. And Syria, which then had 24 million, let in 1.3 million without a visa. If you don't think that these are implications laced with moral attributes, characteristics, then I don't know what would. We have three outstanding speakers, AlSuwaidi, Abdullah Babu, Mohammed AlSulami, and Joshua Yaffe. All of them could handle this session by themselves, but each of them has a piece of it. And we've asked each of them, when they conclude their remarks, to make recommendations of what the United States should do. And not necessarily or only proactively, but in some cases not do or stop doing. AlSuwaidi.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Dr. Anthony. And once again, I'm really honored to be back. Last year I wasn't able to make it, but I'm glad I am now here before you. And I salute John and his team for wonderful annual conferences for the 27th year. And that by itself is a testament for the strong belief by this council, the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, on the importance of building bridges rather than walls between our two nations and people. Let me start off by pointing out that 2 years ago, exactly to the date probably, I was here just before the U.S. presidential elections that brought President Trump as the 45th president of the United States in a major upset against Hillary Clinton. 2 years later, much have changed. And I always ask myself this question: what if Hillary Clinton was the president rather than President Trump? What would have been the scene in the Arab world, and mainly in the GCC states and the wider Arabian Gulf region? And this question probably will linger on for a long time. The relationship, I would like to talk about 2 points. The first point is the lack of strategic depth between the United States and GCC states in particular, especially with the President Trump's administration. As a student and professor of political science and mainly U.S. foreign policy and Gulf security, I'm puzzled by the lack of strategic appreciation by the Obama administration and by the Trump administration. Under the Obama administration, we suffered from a trust deficit. We were underappreciated as GCC major allies of the United States in a tumultuous region that has seen more than its fair share of turbulences, upheavals, and crises. Under President Trump's administration, the trust deficit, in my opinion, has widened. There was jubilation in some parts of the region when President Trump won, an upset victory against Hillary Clinton because of the weakness in our perception of the Obama administration that allowed Iran to control 4 Arab capitals and to boast and brag about that. We were looked upon as an ATM machine and a milking cow. With the Trump administration, that feeling or that perception is lingering on. Add to that the trust deficit, and add to that the continuous taunting and the humiliating attack, especially against Saudi Arabia, and reminding them and us how weak we are and how we are dependent on US security and protection to a level that has not been seen since the relationship started between the two countries and our region 70 years ago. And the continuous taunting and using the pep rallies and the political rallies that President Trump is now swinging, all 11 rallies in last week before the midterm election in 8 states, and keep bringing up the issue of protection, and as if he just orders and he gives his orders and then we have to obey. The point I would like to raise at this point is that there is underappreciation of the importance of the GCC partnership in this country with this administration in particular. We are not free riders, as probably the average American think when he hears President Trump keeps bringing up, we protect them and they pay nothing, we pay nothing. We have bought like $300 billion in armaments. We employ millions of Americans in our investments and our the sales that you make to our part of the world. Your presence, military presence in the Gulf region and the GCC states is a freebie. We don't charge you. You don't pay rent. We don't cost you a penny as taxpayers. Unlike your favorite ally, the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel, that costs you $3.8 billion a year for taxpayers. So keep that in mind, and don't believe everything President Trump says. The last count was 5,000 lies over the last 2 years. And keep counting. What we need to do is really to appreciate each other. It's understandable. I mean, I'm just gave away my notes, so I'm just gonna present what I have in mind. I mean, I'm not reading from my script here. Keep in mind that. Or we know that the United States is becoming more self-sufficient when it comes to energy. Maybe this is shocking news to some of you that the United States now is outproducing Saudi Arabia. The United States produces more oil than Saudi Arabia today. But still, as a leader of the free world, the United States has an obligation to play a major role in leading rather than retrenchment. When I hear, as a specialist in United States and US politics, domestic and foreign, because I taught US government classes at University of Oklahoma State University and at the University of Texas 30 years ago, before I graduated with my PhD from UT Austin, that the relationship between the two parts of the world has really, the United States has really to play its role as the leader of the free world. You cannot really be a leader on the cheap. President Trump today is playing to his base, sending 15,000 troops to the borders of Mexico, US-Mexico borders. That number is more than United States has forces to fight ISIS or Daesh, Qaeda, and Taliban. Against 1,000 people who are marching forward from Central America to the Mexican borders. So my point is that the United States under President Trump has really to look again or to evaluate its position vis-a-vis its allies and state the facts and state the truth. The other point is that I just published recently a book that is now is the bestseller in the Nile and Furat in the Arab world. Just came out in August, and this is the book. أزمات مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية الجذور الأسباب الوساطات وسيناريوهات المستقبل 2011-2018. The Gulf Cooperation Council crisis, the root causes, mediation efforts, and the future of the GCC alliance 2011-2018, very fresh. My argument here in this book is that this crisis was a petty crisis, an unnecessary crisis, and probably it was concocted in a way by bolstering both parties to this crisis from the Trump administration flip-flopping position. And in the book, I argue that this crisis probably wouldn't have taken place in this severity if the president of the Trump administration acted firmly from the very first day of the crisis and not flip-flopping and accusing Qatar in the first few days, or even the first day of the crisis, and then after the deep state intervened, try to be more neutral and then keep going on without really playing the United States leadership to support the Kuwaiti mediation effort, which is the only way out to de-escalate the crisis and bring it to an end. And I blame here the Trump administration in particular for failing to play a major role in the major feud that could threaten the very existence of the GCC states as the only credible, or was the only credible alliance in the Arab world for the last 4 decades. When you see your allies, your very close allies, bickering and fighting, and you not really play a major role in supporting the mediation effort, and President Trump met with the Kuwaiti Emir twice, last September and September 2017, and he pledged to play a major role in solving this crisis because it undermined, the crisis undermines 3 things: the GCC security, the GCC alliance with the United States to fight or to counter terrorism, Daesh, and all the radical organization, and that with and even the war in Yemen, the Arab-led, Saudi Arabia Arab-led war in Yemen that is now since 2015, since March 2015. Even General Joseph Vattel, I don't know if he's here or if he's going to participate, but I think he was here last year. He argues, after the crisis erupted, that the GCC crisis impact negatively the war in Yemen and against the radical groups. And thirdly, it impacts negatively GCC's strong front against Iran, which is a major linchpin policy for the Trump administration to counter Iran, especially with the sanctions now will kick off on the 4th of November to try to really squeeze Iran completely out of oil, to export its oil to the rest of the world. So these policies, and I don't know how much time I still have, but I will end by arguing that
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, thank you. I will argue that we need each other. This alliance will continue. The Khashoggi issue, with all its sadness, and he was my friend, will not impact negatively the Saudi-U.S. relations. There will be some kind of sanctions, but President Trump has been on record clearly that it will not touch the armament or the arms deals that have been signed between the 2 countries. But the relationship really has to, if really President Trump, now there are talks of a GCC-U.S. summit will take place probably in January in Washington. But before that, the United States, President Trump administration, although it's completely submerged with its domestic agenda with the elections and probably losing the House, the Republicans losing the House, and that will impact Trump negatively, if really there is an interest by the Trump administration to see a GCC healthy and back to playing its a major role, as I argue in my book, then the United States has really to play its leadership role, supporting the Kuwaiti initiative, push forward for a resolution of this crisis. And I welcome the positive remarks I heard last week from Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia on Qatar, as it has strong economy and it will be much different and much better in the next 5 years. And also the argument or what the Saudi foreign minister in Manama dialogue stated last week regarding the issue of there is a military cooperation between the GCC states and Qatar, and so there are some GCC troops are stationed in Al-Udeid air base, which is the largest air base the United States uses outside this country. So these positive baby steps, confidence-building measures will have to be built upon by the U.S. administration in support of the Kuwaiti mediation diplomacy to see some kind of resolution to this really unnecessary crisis that is in a zero-sum game, weakening everybody and harming the interest of all of us, even with the interest of the United States at this very critical and juncture time. I finish by saying one last point. If President Trump is serious about establishing the Arab NATO, or as it is called MESA, Middle East Strategic Alliance, then there is homework that has to be done, and that is to resolve the GCC crisis, to have one unison voice, one strong stand to deal with all the crises that are really impacting negatively the stability and security of one of the most important regions in the world, and that is to help solve the GCC crisis. And then we will have a united front facing Iran, facing Daesh, terrorism, and all other consequences. And it's very consequential time that we are living in, and I hope President Trump will step into this effort and help rather than hurt with his continuous taunting that pleases his base but does not solve the crisis that we are really reeling from in our region. Thank you very much.
Next we have Abdullah Babu, who's a fixture of anything pertaining to GCC dynamics. I first came to meet him through the Gulf Research Center's annual Gulf Research meeting in Cambridge for the last 6 years. It's astonishing and embarrassing at how few Americans attend that several-day event. It is the single best cerebral massage pertaining to Arabia and the Gulf that I participate in and benefit from annually. There are anywhere from 300 to 400 participants, and the total number of Americans have never been more than 12, this past year 3. And little things can mean a lot, and I attribute one aspect of the heavy European presence to an agreement between the EU and the GCC maybe 25, 30 years ago, where the GCC wanted to know the names, titles, correct spellings, addresses of every person in Europe who was working on GCC-related issues, who could contribute to the conversation that the GCC countries themselves were having there, that perhaps there were nuggets and strong points here and there of what they were saying and writing and teaching. And the European ones, in turn, wanted to know those in the GCC countries who were working on issues of relevance to the European Union. So that kind of a network is simple, labor-intensive to be sure, but conceptually simple, results in this kind of thing, building up of communications and conversations leading up to compatibilities or disagreements, leading up to consultations and consensus, and leading up also to a degree of trust. But the number one country that is responsible, self-anointed, self-appointed, and almost by default after the British abrogated the last of their treaties for defense and administration of the foreign relations of 9 remaining East Arabian entities, that leadership role came to the United States, and it's a role to which Dr. Shaiji has made reference to, but is not being exerted or shown or performed to anywhere near the effective degree needed by both sides, and not just by the GCC countries and the United States, but beyond that region and the world as a whole. So this area could not be more important than it is. Abdullah Babu is from Oman, but spent a long time in Great Britain in pursuit of his academic studies, and he became the director of the Gulf Studies program at Qatar University. It's the only one in the world. Dr. Abdullah Babu.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here again. Thank you, Jean-Duc, Anthony, and your team for the kind invitation. Always nice to come back to DC and see some friends and make new ones. After all that long introduction, I don't think I deserve it, but it gives me a great pleasure to talk to you today about the topic that we are talking here about, which is, the regional dynamics. Luckily, Jean-Duc, who was sitting next to me, and he whispered in my ears, and he said, "You can say anything you want." So I'm going to take that privilege and say a few things about how do I see it. It's not going to differ so much from what you've been hearing since yesterday. Obviously, you've heard that the region is just moving from one crisis to another. Every time, at least for my lifetime since I became interested in politics and academia and research, been going to different conferences, different seminars, talking around the world, and we just see that the region is just moving from one crisis to the other. It doesn't get better. It's descending in so many different ways. And one last region that we were hoping that it was going to stay intact and protect itself from all these crises was the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. It's really unfortunate to see that the whole region, the whole Middle East, is so much blessed with resources, hydrocarbon, etc., excellent location between East and West, blessed with its own people, with so much diversity and culture. And yet, it seems that it's also a region that is doomed to have crisis, and wonder what is going wrong. And I'm sure this question has been asked many times. Many of us in the region jump to the conclusion that it is the outside. It's the others who are creating this crisis. It's the Americans, it's the Europeans, it's the colonial history, whoever, that we try and point our finger to, we jump into that conclusion. The last thing we really admit is that we are actually the main people who are creating our own crisis. It's not to say that the others cannot be blamed, but it is wrong to point all the time to the outsiders that they are creating our own crisis. We are very good at creating our own crisis. We have excellence in that. Now, what the region doesn't really need is more crisis, obviously. We've had enough of that. What the region doesn't really need is more conflict. It certainly doesn't need more authoritarian regimes, one-man rule that that can sometimes wreak havoc. We've seen examples of that: Saddam, Gaddafi, etc. What the region doesn't really need is proxy wars and competition between regional states. Competition between regional states, they can go on forever, but they are not going to sort out the region. Hegemonic ambitions and trying to bully other states is not going to work. We've seen it. Countries gang against the hegemon. European history has told us about this. And we've seen it in our region. What we don't really need is more waste of resources of what we've got now in terms of oil and gas. It's going to run out, not because we're running out of oil and gas, but because the world is moving on. I recall that Yamani once said, and that was the oil minister of Saudi Arabia, that the world the Stone Age did not end because of lack of stones, and similarly, the oil age is not going to end because of lack of oil. So we need to be careful of how we use our resources, not in creating our conflicts and trying to entering into proxy and sometimes direct wars. What we don't need also is failure of development. All the development models have actually failed in one way or the other in the region. The post-colonial state in the Middle East has not really lived up to its expectations. So what do we need in that case? If we don't need all of this, we don't need also more disintegration. What do we need? And I was actually inspired yesterday by the talk of His Excellency Abdul Latif Zayani, who I caught in a corner after the talk, and I said, look, I really want to salute you on what you had to say. And that was, he had one message, and that was interdependence of the countries in the region. And I asked him yesterday, as I did ask him once before in a conference in Cambridge, Your Excellency, can you elaborate a little bit more on that? I asked. Who's in and who's out of this interdependence? Who are the parties? And in a very tactful and diplomatic way, he gave me an answer that satisfies me to a certain limit, but I'm going to still press him on that at some point. I think what the region needs is interdependence. But I would go also beyond that, if Your Excellency, if you allow me, and I would say more inclusiveness. We need more inclusiveness in the region. We need more inclusiveness within each country, inclusiveness of political participation, for example. We need to build institutions in those countries that can actually create some checks and balances on what's going on. We don't need another Hitler in the region. And without institutions that act as kind of checks and balances, and without freedom of expression and media, another Hitler of some sort will come up. We don't need that. We certainly don't need occupation. We don't need further bullying. We need more cooperation between the countries. We need to accept the countries as they are, as imperfect as they are. The boundaries is not drawn by the socio-political evolution of these countries. It's being drawn by the colonial powers. And we can argue about them for the rest of our lives. Other countries that were also so unfortunate that they were colonized, they have the same problems, but they have managed to overcome it. They accepted the status quo, they accepted their boundaries, they accepted that this is the systems that we have, and we've got to work together in an interdependent world, in an interdependent region, in a more inclusive region. What we don't need as well is people calling for regime change. We don't need that. We have problems with our regimes, certainly we do, but the regimes have also to, in some countries of course, and this have to evolve with time. And we don't want one country calling that we want a regime change in another country. That's not going to work. It's just going to create animosity, it's going to create more crisis in the region. Interdependence, that His Excellency referred to, and inclusiveness, also means that we have to look in a very different way from the way that we've been thinking before. We need a paradigm shift on our thinking. Certainly, a paradigm shift in so many ways. Our attempts at regional cooperation has failed so far. Look at all the regional organizations that have been created in the region. The Arab League, can someone tell me where it is? I know that the headquarters is in Cairo, but it's totally almost ineffective. You've heard about so many other ones like the Maghreb Union, the Arab Cooperation Council, but we still have a Gulf Cooperation Council that has done so much for the integration of the region. And I would also agree with my colleague and friend, Dr. Abdullah Shaiji, who mentioned that this is the most important regional organization that we have. And we've got to hold on to it, despite all the crises that we have in the region. And we've got to try our best to overcome the internal crisis between the countries to keep this very precious regional organization together. But that is not in itself enough. Inclusiveness, I think that His Excellency is referring to, is going beyond that. It's also looking at other countries in the region. What about Yemen? First of all, we need to stop the conflict there. The war has to stop. The people in Yemen have to decide their own future. They want to be in one state or two states, that's their decision. But we got to stop the war, and we got to find a peaceful solution to the conflict. I'm not going to stop. No, I will stop. I think I'm going far too much. Yes. So I think what we need is a much more inclusive regional integration and interdependence. And I think we have to think of the unthinkable. Why can't we even think of cooperating with Iran? Why does it have to be an enemy all the time? Are we doomed to be in conflict with Iran? Why can't we even accept the state of Israel? Of course, after having reached a peace agreement with the Palestinians and guaranteeing their right, why can't we do that and include them into some kind of a regional arrangement? Why can't we get Turkey, Iraq, these countries to work together? The region is so much in need for this. And I will end by saying, John, that what can the United States do here in a very short sentence? The United States had to live up to its own principles and values. That's what we need the United States to do. We need the United States to stop meddling in the region, one thing, but we need the United States to also help in the way that it actually helped Europe to build its own regional stability, security, and regional organization. Again, the Marshall Plan that His Excellency Dr. Zayani had mentioned yesterday is not necessarily coming from the United States, but it could come from the countries in the region. But we could learn from the United States. The United States could help us to achieve the goals that we all need, that is peace, security, stability, prosperity, and the region. And I will end up there, John. Thank you.
Okay. You all right? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Babu, for thinking out of the box. Now, it's our task, when we've grasped the essence of what you recommend, to begin to act out of the box. But action can also be in the form of words. You talk about credibility. No one here would disagree with you on that. And as simple as mean what you say and say what you mean. If you say you really regard international law as one of the most important features of another country with which we would have and retain relationship, then we have to be a model ourselves in upholding international law. If we talk about democratic processes and behavior, then we have to behave democratically in our own processes. Twice in 18 years, the person in this country who got the most votes lost. And I made reference yesterday to the United States and the United Nations Security Council being the Olympic champion of anti-democratic behavior. This needs to stop. Our next speaker is Dr. Mohammed AlSuwaidi, who focuses on Iran and all of its related dynamics.
Good morning. Thanks, John. I will start with describing what has been described the region as the proto-land of religions, what they call it, the cradle of cultures and civilizations, and now it's unfortunately the land of crisis. This is the Middle East, and welcome to the Middle East. The key, I think, words in the title is challenges. And I think we in the region are facing lots of challenges, and maybe in 3 levels, on domestic issues, regional and international levels. If we talk about domestic issues, one of the main problems in the region, maybe, it's the transnational identities. The problem that there is no clear identity for many societies in the region. Going beyond the borders and following like what we call political Islam, or whether to be a Shia or Sunni, both, whether the Wilayat al-Faqih in Iran or the Ikhwan or Muslim Brotherhood in the other part of the world. So this is, I think, a very challenge that we are facing, and we need to find a way to weave the society together regardless their religious belief, and think about our own nationality, our belonging to our lands. So I think there are lots of work to be done on that issue. to even close the gaps through which other countries or political system or regimes use to interfere in our internal affairs. So we have to do our homework first. The second issue, it's the Yemen. It is a challenge, it is a crisis, it is painful fact. I just attended the Manama dialogue. His Excellency Dr. Zayani was there. And some of the European ministers or countries talked about the need to end this war, and sometimes some of them said immediately. And we support that. And we need that more than anybody else because we are suffering from that. We are seeing and facing the problems in our own countries, especially in Saudi Arabia. And I would, if there is really any attempts to end that war, I ask the Europeans, the Americans, whoever wants to end that war, to help us to bring the Houthis, the militias, and to the table of negotiation. We have the national dialogue. We had the Gulf Initiative. We had Kuwait negotiation. And also we had the Geneva negotiation, and the Houthi didn't attend that as well. So please do help us and bring the Houthis to the table of negotiation, taking into consideration their percentage in the Yemeni society, and they will be, or can be, and they should be part of the political map of Yemen. But nobody would accept to have a state within a state. We don't want another Hezbollah in our border, southern border of Saudi Arabia. And I think the Americans wouldn't like to have another state within a state next to their borders, whether they have now 5,000 troops in the border of Mexico, and there is no state within a state, that place. So just put yourself in our shoes and think in that way. In other issues, let's talk about regional issues. I think I would maybe bring your attention to the late Saudi attempts to solve problems in the Horn of Africa. That is a very important part of the world, and it's very important for many reasons. It's for the Americans, for Europeans, for China, for Russia, for our countries in the region. And so we had seen the peace agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and we have seen the meeting, the historical meeting between the leaders of Eritrea and Djibouti in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, like a month or 2 months ago. That attempt means a lot. For one thing that I will come to later on. So I think helping the regional countries to participate in mapping the peace region or peaceful world is very important in that, and I think we need the help in that region and in other places. Another, I think, example I would mention here is Iran. It's my specialty, and Iran is our neighbor. We cannot change geography. We cannot change. We cannot replace Iran with Switzerland or any country. We have to deal with that fact. We have historical ties with Iran, culture, religion, you call it, lots of ties. I've been in Iran many times, I studied in Iran, so it's very important to know that. But our problem is with the political system in Iran, not with the Iranian people, with militias, with the interfering of our internal affairs, with the spying cells, with sending weapons to those groups from Lebanon in the north to Yemen in the south. So if Iran wants to have a better relation with their neighboring countries, they have to stop interfering in our country's internal affairs to reconcile the relation with the neighbor. I will give you an example. Iran thought the nuclear deal would solve our problems with the neighboring countries the GCC will follow directly if they reach a deal with the Western countries, with the United States and P5+1. That was a very wrong, and that was a miscalculation and very wrong thinking. It's proven now, if they started negotiation with their neighboring countries, they will be helpful to reach a very reasonable agreement between P5+1 and Iran. And our problem, I think this is maybe first time to mention this point, our problem not only with the Iranian nuclear weapon, it's with its behavior in the region, but when it comes to the nuclear issue, just think where those bases are placed in Iran. Think about the military, the facilities. Where are they? In Bushehr, Tehran, in Isfahan. Those places are very famous or lines for earthquakes, historically speaking. And you can see it and you can check it in Google or maps or whatever. Just imagine if an earthquake happens in those areas. What will happen to the GCC countries? What will happen to Iran as well? So we have, I don't know, 1 million or more or less Western people living in that part of the world. How would you facilitate them with medical treatments when they come back here? This is one. The what do you call it? The refugees. People will leave that part of the world if something happened, if something leaking there, will leave the world. Will Europe and the United States will accept more refugees from that part of the world? So this is a very important point. The energy, they will have 40% of the world energy comes from that part of the world. That will stop maybe. So the prices will go very high. So think about the regional issues, the things that not being spoken about. And I will finish with the international affairs. And I will talk here about what I see as might be a first step in a 1,000-step journey, which is the changes of the dynamics, changing of ties, changing of the allies between countries. People think China now is emerging very strongly, even slowly but steady. They are now in the Arabian Sea. They are trying to strengthen their presence in Africa. Russia likewise. So how would the Western countries think if, with the current problems, the media attack on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, what would happen if all those countries change their, or start changing, looking to the east? I think it's wise, if you want to, for the Americans, if they want to confront China, they don't need to go to the Asia Pacific. They have to start first from Middle East. So I think this part of the world facing lots of challenges. And I would finish with what has been, what is said now in our part of the world, in Saudi Arabia and other countries, especially about the media issue now, about Jamal Khashoggi. There is nobody clean hand in this world. People think of many occasions, historical problems happened from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from other parts of the world. Nobody blamed the head of states. Nobody was brought to justice. So if we want to reach the point reasonably, we have to help those parts, that the country, Saudi Arabia, in bringing those 15 people or 18 people to justice, but not to use or misuse this event for other political projects in the region. Thank you very much.
We have nearly 20 minutes for questions, and we have some very good ones. Oh, this is the biggest question of all. How could I have overlooked the person who needs no introduction and not to be overlooked? And that's Joshua Yaffe. My apologies, Joshua. No, we've known each other for a good while. And he is in the Department of State and the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, which is not massive in size or personnel or budget, but it's massive in responsibilities to analyze, to read, to find what are the indications, what are the trends, what is it that the policymakers are missing, and those who are dealing with the public, what are they saying. If those who are having a conversation here can please have that conversation outside in the back. Thank you. Joshua Yaffe has been working on these issues for almost half a decade, perhaps a little longer. Please welcome to the stage Joshua Yaffe.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Thank you, Professor Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here. Having attended so many of these in the past, it's an honor to be able to speak at one, and I believe you'll have my mom here in the afternoon, which is also quite an honor. Yeah, it's been about 10 years where I am at State Department now doing GCC in Yemen, which in this town is quite a long time. As many of you will know, there's not a lot of historical memory or institutional memory in a lot of the institutions here in town. But I would just like to preface this by doing the usual acknowledgement. The following remarks are entirely my own and do not reflect the opinions or attitudes of the State Department or the U.S. government. That's the usual disclaimer. Also, I'd like to thank, in addition to the National Council, which is a wonderful institution, I'd like to thank the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies. Many of you saw Prince Turki yesterday. I'd also like to thank the Library of Congress here in town for the wonderful resources that they have to offer. We should all take advantage of them. Now, the focus of my talk will be the bilateral relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a nice, safe topic that was easy to clear through the building. When I say bilateral, I want to emphasize that there was an actual relationship for many decades, both before the Islamic Revolution and after the Islamic Revolution. And when academics address the matter of Saudi-Iranian relations, usually this history of bilateral engagement is relegated to the historical past. It's dismissed as kind of an unnecessary academic discussion. Very theoretical and ahistorical. That's usually what academics, journalists, think tank people prefer to stick to, something that is dealing with the competition for regional leadership, proxy wars in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria, sectarian tensions, very theoretical, high-level, 100,000-foot level discussions. And think tank experts, usually the policy recommendations they make towards the end of their speeches, their papers, whatever it might be, usually they're calling for a back-channel diplomacy in the form of European nations or Japan sponsoring some sort of track 2 discussions or similar back channels. It's almost as though there's never been any direct communication between the two sides and they can't possibly reach out to one another on their own. That's the assumption that's often made in these arguments. I think that reflects a lack of historical knowledge on our part in the West rather than the reality in the region. I believe that our thinking on Saudi-Iranian relations here in the West is often tied to the assumption that two countries have never had normal bilateral relations, that they are somehow immune to rational arguments about the benefits of cooperation, and that a third party is necessary to bridge the gap. I'm not sure I believe any of those things to be true. Now, it is true that today Iran's malign activities in places like Syria, Yemen, and Iraq have placed an enormous strain on the region. It goes without saying. It's also true that it's difficult for Gulf Arab governments to engage with Iran as long as Iranian-backed militias continue to prop up murderous regimes. I think all of our speakers would agree with that. But these two countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, they've been engaged in diplomacy on and off for 90 years, and they have a certain muscle memory in the way that they engage with each other. There's been a learning process over that time. It's been a point of continuity, even with all the changes in the relationship. And as a result, they've developed an understanding of each other and one another's expectations, that's very important for us to take note of. If I could ask Mark to put the slides up, now would be the time to do that, and I'll see if I can figure out how this clicker works. Oh yeah, there we go. So now let's talk about the languages that the two speak, because they both engage with each other a little bit differently in terms of diplomacy. Iran, starting with Iran. So Iran typically seeks high-level visits. They want camera sprays on the tarmac. They want glossy photo spreads in the dailies. The idea is to show the Iranian people and the world that Iran is being treated as an equal by its Arab peers. The Iranians usually send their president, with a request to meet with the Saudi king. Maybe it's the phone. The idea of sending the president to meet with the Saudi king creates the impression that the supreme leader back in Iran is on a higher standing and has no peer in the region. Even a person like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who clearly had no intention of making peace with the kingdom, visited Iran early in his first term. There is a political bonus to be made. What did I say? Oh, yes, okay, sorry about that. I'm so focused on the microphone here. So even a person like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who clearly had no intention of making peace with Saudi Arabia, visited Saudi Arabia early in his first term. You can see the pictures of it. It's exactly what I'm talking about. Ahmadinejad on Hajj, Ahmadinejad eating kebsa with senior Saudi leaders. Have I? Well, in a second, hold on, we're getting to that. Ahmadinejad wearing his clothes from the Hajj in his meetings with King Abdullah. Now, I'm not going to show those because most of those are copyrighted and they're recent. You can look them up online, no big deal. You can Google them now if you like. They're very easy to find. Instead, I would like to show pictures of the 1968 visit of the Shah to Saudi Arabia. Now, you can see just the Times of London, the press clipping that they had, to give you a sense of the visit and what the visit was all about. There were a number of issues at stake. It had been postponed for about 10 months. You can read about it in Faisal bin Salman's book on Saudi-Iranian relations. He does a very good write-up of this. Okay. And here we have the camera spray. I could have shown you the picture from the day before with the Shah and the Shah's wife leaving from the airport in Iran. Of course, you have to have the preliminary picture. But this is the first day of the visit. It was about a 5-day visit in Jeddah. They went to Mecca, they went to Medina. This is all the Saudi press. If someone could please take care of this microphone, it's clearly got problems. Thanks, appreciate it. And there you go, as the visit moves on. Now, I also wanted to show you the Iranian press, because obviously that matters. That matters for domestic consumption. This is a big part of the reason why Iranian politicians want to be in Saudi Arabia. Again, to be seen as a leader of the region and recognized as such by the Saudi king. It's Kayhan. And of course, the best picture of all, and it's hard to read the caption, but it says, at the Masjid al-Nabi in Medina. So, that's how the Iranians express their willingness to reach out. Okay. Now, by contrast, the Saudis, they've always sought the exact opposite. They've sought confidence-building measures as a way to achieve incremental steps on the path towards gradual normalization. These confidence-building measures are generally well known, even today. In fact, some of them were spelled out in the Saudi-Iranian security agreement that was negotiated in 2000. The Saudis want counterterrorism cooperation with the extradition of wanted suspects. They want an end to the malign activities directed against the kingdom. Number 3, they want Iran to participate in the Hajj in a peaceful way that avoids politics and avoids security incidents. Number 4, they want discussions on regional issues. It doesn't mean they want their way on everything in the region, but they want to be able to have an open and honest, transparent discussion about what's going on in the region. And number 5, they want transparency on the nuclear program, as we all do. These are confidence-building measures. This is what Saudi Arabia seeks as a form of quiet diplomacy. They don't need the big camera spray. They don't need the photos in the newspapers. The Saudis were doing this because they understand what Iran's looking for, and it's for Iran's benefit. It's a deliverable. So in that 2000 security agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two people that were negotiating it were Prince Naif, when he was Minister of Interior, and the Iranian Secretary of the National Security Council, who at the time was Hassan Rouhani. It's remarkable to note that the one person who came closest to normalizing ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran is the same person who serves as president of Iran today. And I'd like to share with you an interview that Rouhani gave in 2004, just a couple years after that agreement. Now, he gave this interview to a Saudi newspaper. He gave it to Al-Riyadh. And in that interview, which I'm sorry I don't have up there, it was hard to find on the website again, but I have an old copy that I printed out. You have Rouhani interviewed by a Saudi journalist in a Saudi newspaper telling the journalist that he recognizes, that Iran recognizes, they need to extradite terrorist suspects to Saudi Arabia, they need to affirm the importance of security on the Hajj, and that they need to deny any export of the revolution in any military or political sense. He is speaking the language of the Saudis, and he's doing it to a Saudi newspaper so that they can get the message, they can have their fears assuaged. He understood the concerns of the Saudis, he understood how to message them through their own press, and more than that, the Saudis are capable of doing the same thing. When we look back at that 1968 visit, you see King Faisal, who has very specific confidence-building measures on his mind relating to a maritime border treaty, and he gives an interview months before, in May, through a Kuwaiti newspaper, As-Siyasa, in which he tries to assuage the Iranian fears regarding a maritime treaty and shared oil fields in the northern part of the maritime border. So you see these two countries speaking each other's diplomatic language, not just in the past, but today. We can go all the way back to King Abdulaziz, and you can see the same process at work. King Abdulaziz is facing widespread accusations by his rivals that his forces have damaged the holy sites in Mecca and Medina as he takes over the Hijaz. So he invites all the Muslim nations to come and verify that the cities and their inhabitants have been treated with respect and dignity. The first person who responds to that call is Reza Shah. He sent 2 delegations October 1925, and around the same time he offered to mediate between Ibn Saud and the Hashemites during the siege of Jeddah. He also sent a representative to the Islamic Conference of Mecca in 1926. All these things are very typical aspects of Iranian diplomacy. And you see Ibn Saud responding by looking for recognition, which he gets, the Friendship Treaty of 1929, signed in Tehran. But moving on. Okay. I'm going to wrap up, since I know we're over time. Now, as far as Rouhani goes today, and the situation today, obviously the president of Iran doesn't make every decision in Tehran. The supreme leader is the one who decides whether Iran is ready for peace in the Gulf, and the supreme leader clearly is not ready for that. And ever since the Saudi embassy and the consulate were destroyed by mobs in January 2016, there's been little prospect for reconciliation. Yet I hope that these examples illustrate the fact that even though the two sides have had very different expectations of one another, they know what the other is looking for, and they know how to engage if they choose to. They have a historical memory of engagement both before and after the Islamic Revolution, with a continuity of that process all the way through, and they're capable of working out their differences on their own when the time is right. There's no kind of Western-led back-channel mediation that might somehow magically show these two neighbors how to bridge their divide in a way they haven't already considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh, and renewed apologies and repentance here will mean that on the generalized questions, you can be the first to answer. Okay. All right. Here's a good one. well, they're all good. I don't know to whom this question is best put, but it strikes me that there is so much knowledge and experience in this room. Many were struck by the challenges in the Middle East some decades ago and positioned themselves to orient their entire careers to the Middle East. What are we doing, and what should we be doing to grow this population? It's a recruitment question of where are the Arabists. In the past, they came from the children of the nurses and doctors that went to Bahrain and Kuwait and elsewhere in Oman and fell in love with the region. They exist no more. And then they were the children of the oil company executives and managers and senior administrators. There are almost no Americans in that capacity now. You can count them on the fingers of one hand. And then there were some who were military brats whose parents had served in Bahrain or Libya or other countries, and they were smitten. You don't have any of those anymore, except in Bahrain, yes, you would, where there are estimated 11,000 American naval-centric people on any one day. In Kuwait, more than that, maybe 15,000 or so, and higher numbers still at the various armed forces bases there. And then air personnel in the United Arab Emirates, but to a far greater extent in Doha, Qatar. And it's from that latter presence that the air surveillance and other dropping of munitions in Afghanistan is directed towards the east and then towards the west, focusing on Syria and Iraq. And that has continued despite the rupture at the interpersonal level of the leaders of the member states. After those three groups left, you had some Peace Corps people in Libya, Tunisia, Morocco in particular, Turkey and Iran in particular, and only a handful once in Bahrain and two handfuls twice in Oman, but many handfuls in Yemen, to the degree that an American Institute for Yemeni Studies was formed and still exists. So if anyone want to comment on that one, I'm going to read them all and you can pick and choose there. How and to what extent will regional tensions hurt infrastructure projects, such as the GCC railway? Well, we know that that's stalled and it missed its target date. But to what extent is it still valid and viable for the future? And what will be the implications for that? And perhaps that will be answered best by Abdullah Babu. Another one is, how would Saudi Arabia react to the re-emergence of South Yemen as a state? So you've had previous efforts to secede by those who live in South Yemen and want to restore what was once the People's Republic of South Yemen, then the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. The Iranian military budget is but a small fraction of that of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the Emirates, Qatar. and Israel as well as Turkey. How do you respond to this question, that Iran's presence in other countries in the region may be, from an Iranian perspective or an objective, clinical, detached viewpoint, a form of forward defense in its missile development designed to deter attacks on Iran? And then lastly, it's a soft one. How important is coordination of foreign policy for the GCC in the absence of coordinated policy? Joshua, you can take a whack at one of those.
From down here? Yeah, okay, the mics are on, good. Okay, so, yeah, how would, I could try and tackle the Yemen question, I suppose. How would Saudi Arabia react to the reemergence of a South Yemen? Look, there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there. They've been out there for 30 years about the Saudi interests in the Hadramaut, of oil pipelines going down to the coast. I don't know how much of that is true or not true over the years. I'm not sure how much of that is propaganda by separatists in southern Yemen who would like to justify or legitimize their separatist ambitions. I think that Saudi Arabia is pragmatic at the end of the day. I think they understand that this is their backyard and they have to work with whatever comes out of the war and the ambitions of strong militias in Aden that certainly don't believe in united Yemen anymore. You've seen over the decades Saudi Arabia reacting very quickly to circumstances that were not under its control in Yemen. And I would assume that whatever the Yemenis decide or whatever the Yemenis come to in the end of this war, that Saudi Arabia will adjust. And we'll find a way to work, hopefully, with whoever does emerge from that. That doesn't mean that Saudi Arabia doesn't have preferred outcomes. The problem is I'm not sure how much people in Riyadh have thought through the desired outcomes they want to achieve, especially in terms of second-order effects or third-order effects. And I think the best thing that the Saudis could do now is to think about contingency scenarios so that they are prepared for whatever outcome does emerge. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
All right. Abdullah Babu, could you articulate the question that I handed you on a card, and then be the person who has the first whack at how and to what extent will regional tensions hurt infrastructure projects such as the GCC railway. So just focus on that.
Thank you, John. I think the two are somehow related, and I would start by saying that just taking a step back and saying, what is the GCC? What is the Gulf Cooperation Council? In a simple word, it's a regional organization that is based on rules. It's a rule-based organization. And it is independent, but yet connected to the member states. And this is something that regional integration theories tells us. And this is how the EU, that somehow the GCC is trying to resemble itself on the EU, is actually functioning. Now, regional organizations, they are based on rules. And the first and foremost is you have to respect those rules. These rules are signed by the member states, by the leaders of the member states. And in this case, the GCC Cooperation Council signed a number of rules and agreements. One of them is the most wanted, is the common market, which was referred to by His Excellency yesterday, which calls for a free flow of goods, people, and capital. Amazing agreement that, you know, the whole region becomes one market, as it were, which is great for development, for investment, for employment, and for social contacts. So the current crisis, unfortunately, touched on this agreement. And unfortunately, you know, whether we call it a boycott or a blockade, has touched the rule of the GCC states that have written down. And also, within the GCC state, there are decision mechanisms. One of them is the Supreme Council. So any change to the agreement has to go, logically, to the Supreme Council. This current crisis in the Gulf with Qatar has taken place outside the mechanisms of the GCC, but it relates to the GCC agreement, which I think inadvertently undermines the GCC, which I don't think when they took this decision, the leaders thought about it. So what we need to do is get respect back to the GCC as an independent regional organization that have been agreed between these states. And then from there onwards, start activating the agreements that we already have. Because this crisis, unfortunately, that we're witnessing now in the Gulf, has stopped, in some ways, you know, trade between the member states, has stopped movement of people, etc., and investment. What we need to do is also, because of this agreement, some kind of cooperative project that the GCC was working on has been affected. One of them is the railway. How could you have a railway when one country is outside or is being boycotted or blockaded? How can you have regional projects like, you know, the electricity grid, etc.? How can you build confidence within the people of the GCC, let alone the leaders of the GCC states that are not part of this conflict? But also, how can you build confidence within the partners of the GCC, like the US, like the EU, like other global powers that are negotiating with the GCC? So unfortunately, without thinking, I hope it was not intended, this agreement has actually undermined the GCC, and I hope that the GCC will come back and activate its role for what it's really been, what was doing such a good job in terms of regional integration, cooperation, etc. And activate its dispute resolution mechanism that is there to sort out problems within the GCC. Now, what countries can do to enhance cooperation? That was a question, I think, that was asked from the floor. I think, first of all, they need to end conflict and they start confidence-building measure and respect the rules that they have signed. If you don't do that, how can you think about moving forward with cooperation? So you need to expect existing agreements, you have to activate them, and you have to learn also, we have to learn from other regions in the world. We're not the only region that has conflicts as well and disputes, etc.
Thank you.
Asia, and finish there. Asia has its own, but it has ASEAN. South America has its own. It has Mercosur. So we can learn from these agreements, from these regions, and develop from there onwards. Thank you.
Thank you. I know it seems unfair or inhumane, cruel, and something worse to truncate a session where you have this kind of heavyweight intellectual assemblage of specialists. AlSuwaidi wanted to make a further comment on Iran, but it has to be short and crisp and to the point, Abdullah. And a more generalized one is just to assess the Trump administration's successes, if any, since the Trump administration has taken office on issues of concern to the GCC. And Mohammed, you jump in here too, but go ahead, Abdullah.
There is the issue of abdication and entrapment, the security dilemma that we teach regarding security dilemma of partnership between a small ally and a major, powerful ally. The smaller party to this alliance, in our case, is the GCC states, feel either they are entrapped by the policy that is undertaken by the more powerful ally, which is United States, either by abandonment, as it was the case under the Obama administration when he struck a deal behind closed doors with the Omani participation, and then later on, after it was divulged in Geneva without us knowing as the allies of United States regarding the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, or the fear of abandonment or the entrapment that we do not have a say in what's going on. Right now with the Trump administration slapping Iran with heavy sanctions and cutting off its oil export to all the world, what are the drawback of this? Is he helping the hardliners? Is there a plan B? So there is an issue of security dilemma that always is with the smaller junior partner to this alliance. Then with the taunting and the continuous attack by Trump himself against Saudi Arabia, reminding them how weak they are, reminding them the protection, reminding them they have to pay. And that, if he does that to Saudi Arabia, how about the smaller Gulf states? On top of that, I'm just finishing, on top of that, there are now major books coming out by Richard Haas regarding the world in disarray, and recently the Empty Throne by Dadler and Lancy about the United States abdication its role and leadership in the world. How does that play in the minds of the leadership and the people of the Gulf region and other United States allies? So we are, in my opinion, I close with this, at crossroads between us and the United States. We have a trust deficit and lack of confidence with this administration and among the GCC states because of the Qatar issue and because of the GCC crisis. One last point in last half a minute regarding Iran budget. Yeah, it's true. It's marginal compared to the GCC, especially Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and UAE and even Qatar. But Iran outplays everybody in the region with what we call asymmetrical warfare, and how they deploy their revolutionary guard and how they choose capitalize on our mistakes by being in these critical countries like Lebanon, like Syria, like Yemen, and we do not have that inkling that the Iranians or that proxy power that the Iranians have. So don't look at numbers only, look at how Iran utilizes and take advantage of the region and of its allies that it has fostered and played a major role in propping them up over the last decades.
Thank you, Abdullah. Those were superb responses. I hope those taking notes took note of those points, because you can use them in your own conversations for a multiplier effect of beneficial dimensions. He punched through some of the misinformation and faulty conceptualization regarding the region. Now I'm going to do two things. I'm going to ask the four to, in 40 seconds, to go to the back and to the atrium there. And those who ask questions that we couldn't get to, you can go back, you should go back, you must go back there and pump them with the questions in the atrium area so you will not disturb the next session coming here. But Mohammed, I guess the last word, 2 minutes.
Well, maybe shorter than that. The first question is about the budget. I can't agree more with Dr. Abdullah. Iran on sanctions in terms of importing weapons. So they try to do it at home, but also they try to, they buy weapons from North Korea and China, and sometimes from Russia, which is maybe cheaper compared to the Western countries. So this is a point. Also, it is a matter of how to use this weapon rather than whether to buy weapons or not. This is the first question. The other question is about forward the presence of Iran, which some people call it forward strategy or presence strategy, the defensive strategy. This is the Iranian narrative. They use it everywhere, that we are defending ourselves. But just think about it. Yemen is not a very close country to Iran. It's not with the border, so you cannot call it a defensive. Nigeria, where is Ibrahim Zakzaki militias, is not a defensive. So, and there is no threat from those countries against Iran. They are the one who are attacking those countries. So a defensive strategy cannot really accept it, and it's not illogical in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. Please join me in a note of appreciation for this superb panel.